let's talk about ALQ1, Golden Voyages for Al-Qadim by David Zeb Cook. This is an adventure module for a campaign box, indeed it says, campaign source box, but it's an adventure module, an extended adventure module for Al-Qadim. Al-Qadim is a 1992 campaign setting. Here's the core rulebook, Al-Qadim Arabian Adventures, obviously using the same sort of dress in terms of naming format as Oriental Adventures. That's by Jeff Grubb, and it goes with a box set too called Land of Fate, which were the sort of first two. This is the first of the kind of source coded modules that came out, and they're little boxes mostly. I think one adventure called Reunion is not, but all the other expansions are boxes, mostly small boxes. And this is part of the gimmick of Al-Qadim. Like, you know, each setting you realise when you look at TSR in the late 80s and 90s has a gimmick or a set of gimmicks to do with its publishing. And for Al-Qadim, there are a few things. One is a limited run. I'm going to do a couple of reviews this month on it. It was a limited run, and they actually did just end it eventually. And two, yeah, particularly, the thing was you bought these little slipcases, but they're not slipcases, boxes, small boxes. Inside you get 6, the format of this one, and this is not universally the format of these, but you get 6 little booklets, and then you get a small number of miscellaneous other bits. You get a DM screen, which has okay art on it. You get a map in the house style, which is, where are the credits on this one? One thing about this particular format of these 6 booklets is that it doesn't actually have like a single credits section or whatever, which is kind of annoying. Cartography is Dave Sutherland. So this is Dave Sutherland just before his cartography becomes completely unbearable. And he never quite becomes unbearable on high level maps. He's kind of okay. But yeah, this is the house style for Al-Qadim. And most of the maps in the little box sets, or the box sets, do actually fit together on the same scale. I think there's one that's weirdly off scale, but you can both get a big level map of the Land of Fate, Zakara, from the box set Land of Fate, and you can turn all of that into higher res via the smaller box sets. The map is pretty good. It has like points of interest marked on it and whatever else. And then you've got 3 monsters: Keelanite or Seelanite, Ogrima, Satani. You then have a list of NPC crewmen for your ship with names, and you have ending the adventure. This is a weird one because this obviously would be in just the source book. If there were a source book, but it's instead on a monstrous compendium sheet of all things. There is one reference, I think, grand total to Al-Qadim Monstrous Compendium, which is slightly harder to find in original, kind of in antique copy. But other than that, monsters are generally going to be Monstrous Compendium, Monstrous Manual, kind of core ones. So the books, basically, the idea is that though the conclusion is on that one random sheet, the majority of and you start the adventure in a particular city called Ghana, and that gives you a variety of potential hooks, which I'll touch on in a second. Most of it is these 4 middle booklets. You're just sailing around the crowded sea on Sinbad adventures. The theme is Sinbad, and the high level review of this is decent. There are things about this I actually really like. I think there's some really good ideas, good locations, good setups. Genuinely, against perhaps people's expectations, I think it's an interesting adventure. It has some good things. It has some horrendous subsections and particular passages and railroads, and this is complex as to whether or not this is a good or a bad thing. It is a thing that's a failure. Basically, Cook looks to push the format of D&D adventures, and in this case, Naval Adventures, which is a subset of D&D, which is complex, hard to do. And he tries to push it into fitting a genre right on the edge of D&D. And by that I mean not just, it's a sort of Sinbad-ish, but very much like the tropes and themes of the actual kind of the films around Sinbad and related films of the 60s and 70s particularly. And there's a reminder there. What reminds me of, as I think back, I think now, is of more recent products, not something which is kind of close to that, say 7 Voyages of Xylithan, not that at all, which is just an AD&D spin-off, which is kind of using that to help you play some of that, get a sense of that Appendix N reference. But rather, it's more like those modern OSR products and Heartbreakers and whatever else, which really which use the core rules of D&D, or Basic particularly, to try to really emulate and push a specific subgenre, rather than the whole milieu. And I think it is basically, some of those things kind of work okay actually, but I think that it is ultimately not successful because I think the core D&D gameplay relies on a slightly more open experience, an open world. But it's interesting to see. It's not worthless to see. So good, lots of good ideas, some cool locations, cool ideas, cool setups. Bad, some specific elements and mini adventures, and kind of indifferent or potentially useful in some ways but not in others, is just the general dynamic and format of the adventure. You know, the kind of sense that it's pushing for a particular genre. So the home port, where it begins, first one, basically gives you the setup. It gives you a bunch of starting hooks, and it gives you hooks. It gives you rules. And the big idea is that you're out to find a great treasure, and the great treasure could be for various reasons. So the gimmick is that you have to go around the crowded sea to find the great treasure, and that's fine. You can go and find the great treasure. And there are clues you can get. They'll point you to different locations, and you as the DM give out the clues based on particular accomplishments. If people accomplish a clue location, they get a clue. You pick which one it is. It points them to the next place. There's not now that itself as a setup. It took me a few times round to work out, particularly because at first, when I first read it, I literally was like, "Oh, there's some monstrous compendium sheets. I'll look at that later." And I didn't get how the adventure ended because of the placement of the adventure end information on an MC sheet. But the actual format of the adventure, I think the grand campaign is weak but unnecessarily so. You don't have to do it that way. The setup, the idea of finding a great treasure for one of many possible hooks, that's good. That's actually very strong. And I'll talk about that slightly more in a second. But the fact you're like, oh, you have to give them these clues that force them to go to these, because that's the only place they can go, you know. And that is an unnecessary railroad. Sometimes you can see an adventure is only going to work based on a railroad idea that someone's come up with. You're like, oh, okay, I can see that to get players to do this, this has to happen. And this is a Zeb Cook problem, actually, of adventures that are like that. Freedom is like that, which is a largely frustrating Dark Sun adventure I've reviewed on this channel. Vecna Lives is a very bad Zeb Cook adventure, which heavily relies on that. This is a couple of steps up from certainly for Vecna Lives, but also from Freedom, that there are interesting things going on here. And there is a genuine adventure idea, but he still is prone to using that format. And one thing I think I realised when someone said his home game was a duet, it was him and his wife. And I thought, here's an insight that when you're in a very small group with 1 or 2 players, there is often a greater requirement, not always, but a greater requirement for DM fiat and DM initiative. Oh, this is what happens. Because players, the larger the group, the bigger the brain trust and the more energy. And I suspect, without knowing for sure, that probably affects his design, that he ends up with things which are easy to run in duet play. But yeah, the idea, so one thing, a really interesting thing, and it's probably for some people sounds very new school, but I have always approved of this way of understanding tables, is the Great Treasure. There are options, potential options for 5 types of player. And you may be familiar with the kinds of players that you get identified in. It might even be, I think it's actually technically even in, is it the 2nd edition? It's not the DMG, it's in the campaign guide, I think, the Jaquiz campaign guide. But yeah, so here we've got power gamers, warlords, role players, storytellers, and puzzle solvers. And the idea of like things that might appeal to different kinds of players. Lots of some of the items are good, many are just kind of fine. There's one which is The Seal of Fate allows characters re-rolls, essentially. And it's kind of stamped that each player can have one Seal of Fate and it may eventually dissipate. The Blade of Mastery can be used once, and it's a kind of ethereal blade that improves a prime requisite. Warlords, neither of those are particularly exciting. So you can see the power level they're aiming at. Oh, the power gamers who want just to do well can get some small amount of power or rerolls. The Voice of the Great Lion gives you a fortress. The Spirit of the Wandering Legion gives you a one-off calling of a very capable army of the descendants of some famous warriors. Role players might like something which judges between Ghana and Jumlat over the Pearl Beds up in the Pearl Cities, because Ghana is where it starts, etc., etc. Storytellers might have the Crab God's Shell, which if they get it, then that will really please the Sultan, and though it's not useful for the players, it's a cool item. You can see there's an attempt to give different things that you might get your players going, might get them interested. Now, of course, actually, though the basic format of, you just have a treasure, you use the clues to point them around, is the railroad to get them to that item. The idea that you could just have several of these treasures out there on rumour tables is a very easy fix. And though I always resent having to fix modules, I think it's worth saying it's not a big problem. It's not actually that difficult in this case. The opening adventures, you have one where they buy a map, one where the Sultan announces a quest for an item, another where a wizard Gaius is, presumably a rogue, to get him to find something, and one is essentially the need to pay off the debt on the boat you're buying. So to do that, you take instructions to go and find the great treasure. You then get a section on ships, and this is sort of Arabian themed ships. So, one thing when I say Arabian, this is something that's discussed in this book, in Arabian Adventures itself, that we're not talking about an attempt to closely approximate historical Arabia or present historical Arabian cultures of whatever era to the audience. It's a mixture of some historical Arabian stuff, some of our cultural ideas of, I guess you could say, kind of like that sort of the desert culture and genies and stuff, and specifically also Sinbad. Those are the three influences. So when I say Arabian style ships, I don't mean a close approximation of every historical Arabian ship, but 5 types. And there's costs of depending on where you buy them, is it, or is it? I don't know. And then there's some rules about navigation and finding locations based on. It's interesting here that second gives you. I can think of 3 or 4 different sets of naval rules. The ultimate version being DMGR 9 or whatever it is of ships in the sea. But you also have some bits and pieces in the 2E DMG. Of course, you've got some in the 1E DMG as well. You have some here. I think there's some in Sea of Fallen Stars. I think there's some in, and you get some naval modules, so particularly the Sargon trilogy, which just have some do reference to ships in the sea, to be fair, but also add some generic extra bits and pieces. So there's all kinds of options about your naval rules if you're wanting them. But here, you have some instruments that they can use, which can give navigation kind of improvements. Rules about finding harbours on islands, basic, that's the thing that's not covered elsewhere. Here, this is obviously an emergent gameplay thing. Oh, well, they're on an island, they're looking for your player will say, and I've literally had players ask this when sending boats, oh, is there a harbour nearby, a harbourage, somewhere we can just drop anchor in shelter? And I think that's basically good. Like, I think this is interesting that some of these things reflect things that might happen in play, and whether or not this is David Cook's idea or Jeff Grubb's idea or whoever, it doesn't really matter. But I think it's interesting that it's plainly come up. Stuff about hazards, stuff about pirates. I mean, just these are actually reasonably functional. They are. I was going to say, actually, here's another 2nd edition set of naval rules. Spelljammer is not the same thing, but it again, another discussion and approach to kind of that sort of thing. Rules about repairs. The story possibility of castaways, what will happen when they need to find a new ship, because the assumption is they'll lose ships. There's then a section on crew and crew positions, and the crew positions thing is perfectly useful in itself. And there's a short section about cargo and trade too, which is much less deep. The back of this does have a list of randomized cargoes. It's a much less deep trading system than you get in Dune Trader for Dark Sun, or even some of the Birthright stuff in Havens of the Great Bay, or a few other places like that. It is just because they're not going around sailing, you know, if they have any extra business, it's not military, for instance, they make the point, and it's not really pleasure. I guess there's exploration, but people are making money, you know, it's trading. So they do put that in just to fill it in. For the crew, though the information is okay, a highlight of stretching the genre is this sense that the crew are completely disposable, essentially. Apart from the cook, apparently. What does it say? Yeah, role-playing the crew is that, as befits the Sinbad style theme of Golden Voyages, player characters should seldom, if ever, become concerned about their crew. There's a comment on mutiny. If you actively mistreat them or avoid their dangers, then they might mutiny. But most of the men needed to work the ships like extras in a movie. Seamen never heard. Speaking parts should be reserved for the Nakuda, Ruban, Rabania, and of all the common seamen, the cook. When ordinary seamen do make an appearance, it should be to deliver no more than a line or two. Praise be fate, land, or these waters are evil, esteemed one. No ship has ever, just as a poor sailor is snatched from the deck by the sea serpent. So you see here it's not mechanically themed. It's something which is not, it's pre-forge. It's not using a playbook or a mechanic for NPCs to create a particular situation. It's just saying, as the DM, this is what these NPCs are like. And lots of DMs will be fine with this. So in a sense, you know, who am I to complain about something that lots of DMs would be fine with? My problem is that I think you can see it eroding core gameplay structures of D&D. When you have hirelings, mechanics govern how the hirelings relate to you. There are mechanics for paying them, there are mechanics for their loyalty, for their action and reaction in dungeons, etc. And I think they're reducing the chance of mutiny to a non-mechanical discussion of, you know, basically, if you treat them badly, they might mutiny, is weak. But it's an attempt to emulate the genre, so that's why I offer this as a partial criticism rather than a full-blown one, because there's a realisation that mechanics, or at least play, and genre have to connect. And that's true and underappreciated. I just think it's something which D&D is a particular kind of game, and completely removing a strut, i.e. NPC management, is a good way to damage the whole. And I think you see the end game of that in a lot of 5th edition material. You then have the 4 island chains that you can go to. Al-Sartan, which is the crab one, shaped like a crab. Nada al-Hazan, the Jinni's Claws, and the Steaming Isles. Now, technically, Book 3, Nada al-Hazan, has the one significant, the biggest settlement, Bandar al-Sadat, which you're directed to first. The first clue, which you have to have. That's the clue that all the hooks give you, sends you here. Now, what happens in each of these is sometimes you have some thematic writing. You always have like thematic writing on the front, including a bit of a legend. You have suggested creatures on the particular place. On Nada al-Hazan, it's giant ants, giant antlions, antelopes, blah, 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 blah. Huge spiders, tempests, any vultures, nymphs, orpsus. It's not a table, it's just a list of if you're looking for stuff to be there. Again, here you obviously have a step back from a traditional core strat, which is the idea of an emergent world. When you're exploring, there are emergent events. Now, in fact, what you've already been told is that essentially, and this will come up in adventures, mini adventures within the books, when a thing needs to happen, you just make it happen. You know, there's no emergent random encounters in that way. There's just events that happen. This is very high TSR, very trad gaming, in the sense that classic gamers use that pejoratively. It's very much mid-era trad gaming, very much first half of 2E publishing, pre-Cordell. There are some other exceptions in that era. We spoke about them with Prince a couple of months ago, actually. But here, you got all of those things on show, and Cook gets away with it better than many adventures, but it's still a kind of bother. So yeah, you've got a town you can go to. You've got quick summaries of the other islands, and this again tends to be the case. of the different islands in this chain. Then it has this has a couple of adventures in it. This one, A Night in Town. A Night in Town is actually one of is actually one of the worst adventures in here, mostly because it has a whole set of advice about how you have to pick a player who's not clever enough to realise what's happening to them and isn't playing a thief. Preferably they're playing a lawful character who is mistaken for the famous thief Firouz. And then there's a bunch of people who are chasing you around. Some people want to hire you. There's guards who might want to arrest you. You're not allowed to kill the NPCs. You're told that very explicitly. And there's some kind of fun locales. This is actually the thing that again shows you that there's an idea of an adventure here. Okay, there's a cool coffee house that's quite nice. There's, the idea that you can have a particular kind of experience in a near empty night bazaar, etc. And that you might escape via sailing away. All of that's perfectly decent, and the locales are okay, even if they are, just a couple of paragraphs. But of course, it's that it's being strung together to have a particular result. A certain thing has to happen. The Isle of Sadness is the other adventure here, and this is an interesting one where there is actually another reasonable size settlement of a town where no one can remember the LORE, the law, which is obviously the parallel to Islam and Muhammad, is that there's a lawgiver who has kind of given what the true gods have to say about these things. And they've forgotten it. They've been cursed due to their arrogance, and someone has to go to the top of the Tower of Test and answer that the greatest sadness is losing the law. And essentially, it's an underexploited opportunity that could, and there's a couple that are like this. In some cases, you have mini adventures which are really just an encounter. Here, you have a whole thing that ends up being like, oh, essentially, you just have to not really annoy this genie, and you have to guess the answer. And it's kind of, though it's in some ways quite a simple answer, the players understandably might miss it. So here's some hints you could give them. And that's kind of quite boring. It's a good idea. There's different levels of a good idea here. There's some which are, oh, that's a good idea, even if I'm not 100% convinced, but it's pretty good. And then there's, that's a good idea, but it's not developed. And this is one of those, it's not developed ones. So Nada Al-Hazan gives you a location that's quite usable, but otherwise not particularly good. Al-Sartan. This is actually pretty decent. Again, you have suggested animals. This one, Minotaur lizards. There is one Zakaran place you can go to, and then there are a couple of potentially friendly tribes. There's a halfling tribe and a human tribe, and these are both potentially befriendable. There's also on one island the Gurum, which is a tribe of Ogre Magi, Ogre and Ogrim. This setup, and again, these things often you're getting only a column per thing, and that's not necessarily bad. I like things being compressed in some ways, but I think it's fair to say that you could always do with more on some of these things. If this is going to be the thing the players interact with, give us information on that. One thing about the nature of this is that this is a whistle-stop tour over, these reach like 16-page booklets or whatever. This is meant to be a, what do you mean to say? That is 32, 16, 16, so that's 32 again. So that is 96 plus the map booklet is going to be, I don't even know. Yeah, 16. It's 112 pages. Is that right? 112 pages. So it's a whistle-stop tour, so you understand why this happens, but it's nonetheless a shame. The adventure is an interesting one. It is a workable one. It's actually one of the most developed. It's 9 pages long, I think. It's basically not a bad idea. The idea is that the halflings want to fight, basically need to get help because the troubles they're having with the ogres, and the ogres are connected to this the avatar of a power who is based on pandemonium, and there is a portal the avatar can come through, and essentially the halflings are looking for information or something like that. It's a terrible threat, and the god of the waters, Kararaga, has been driven mad by the dark magic of the Gurum, and basically you have to kind of deal with this. And so things can go wrong. There's a whole discussion about what happens if the players attack the halflings who are bringing an embassy to Sam's Bandar, the Zakaran, the kind of civilized human settlement. Yeah, you can then go and see them. There's things that could happen along the way. It is a classic high TSR. Depending on your mood, it's either an uneventful trip or a few random but not overly extreme encounters. 2 Bahari, 20 giant crabs, or 4 common sharks. So yeah, this is when you're travelling to see the humans and make friends with them and get more information again. Then some ogres raid the humans and you need to help them. And then you need to go and deal with the ogres. And there's plenty of information on the ogres. It's not quite set out. There's some kind of like, oh, well, if you interact with these people, they might do this. Yeah, you know, there might be some opportunities to do things in slightly different ways, but there's really ultimately one main approach through that section. So, and then you need to go and more or less you have to shut the portal before the avatar gets out. So there's a nice setup, there's some nice ideas. There's occasionally discussion about, oh, what happens if the players do this or this. There is an opportunity if you'd like to add in the mechanics again for random encounters. There's an interesting idea of dealing with the Ogre Magi and then stopping the avatar coming and laying waste to stuff. But it ends up quite linearized. Book 4, the Ginny's Claw, so that's the only adventure there. It's decent, it's okay, it's usable, it's salvageable. The Ginny's Claws is one where, again, you have a genre experiment. Here, you only have a couple of pages. You have 3.5 pages of stuff about the islands, and then you actually have the rest of it being adventures. So you have very much an adventure-based one. And these are very much pushing the genre edge. And I think it does say something here. But to do with Broken Talons, the first one, basically is that this, oh yeah, basically if you're familiar with the old Weird Tales stories, consider these pulp fantasies a guide to the proper atmosphere. Other inspirations are old jungle movies, Sinbad adventure movies, the lurid medieval theories and monsters found in distant lands. And while the action of the adventure is fairly simple, it will be much more elaborate if careful attention is paid to setting and description, and talking about how you should describe stuff. And there's definitely a place for description, I think, in running the adventure, rather than just giving the most bare bones thing possible. I think a bit of evocation is good. But again, you can see what we're pushing here is for a genre experience, and the setup is more or less that you need to get wrecked. The arrival is that you go to a lagoon on Kaf. You're trapped by some sea knights, and then you kind of are hosted by a mage who's not very nice and ultimately wants you to go and get a rock talon. He's an elven fighter wizard. And then there are a couple other female characters involved, and a particular thing here is, and there's a whole discussion about this, is about how to run and develop romance with one of them. There's definitely some sort of sense of reference to Jack Vance in some of this. And yes, and you need to, there's then, yeah, as you go around, if you agree eventually to go and do this job, you're meeting these characters, you're talking to them. You can then encounter stuff like ghast, ghouls, and Sioux monsters. So use the jungle encounter tables to create encounters, or create them using the ones mentioned and those stats. Then there is a very linear kind of thing where you go and potentially are either hosted by some Rom, some giants, Zakaran giant types, or fight them. And there are ways around that. At the same time, it's kind of, they're kind of undead Zakaran giants. The expectation is that probably you're going to fight them, and that's how you're going to get some treasure, some dinars, 3,000 dinars, and a canoon of quite good treasure. Albeit, the ROM are worth 10,000 XP each. One thing is, this isn't leveled. I think it does say on the back. Yeah, essentially it's that different areas are appropriate for different levels, and you're not often told the levels. It's usually fairly obvious. These are 15 HD undead giants, you know, work it out. You're talking about a level 12 or 13 party. This is suitable as an adventure for the back end, and this is an interesting thing here that isn't addressed, but is essentially like, how do you, and at 5th edition adventures end up solving by just saying, oh, just tell the players they've leveled up, but how do you deal with this problem or this issue of getting enough experience in a game that in addition of the game that has incredibly wobbly XP rules, which are fixable, but again are, you know, start off very wobbly. And essentially you can, you know, the good lady can help you, and you can escape on a rock, and that's kind of fun. The other idea, and this is also a fun one, and also oh sorry, there's 2 more adventures here. They're a lot shorter. That one is like 8 pages. So you've got a lot of stuff about these NPCs you can interact with, and the stakes for each of them and the character things. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that though some of the ideas there are, again, decent, one is kind of linear, because in the end you go up the mountain and you have to do the encounters. There's a bit of emergent play walking around the jungle. But yeah. But the other thing is, of course, that it relies heavily on players who are going to enjoy a high degree of modern meaning roleplay. You know, people really getting into talking to these NPCs and negotiating with the RAM and so on. Servitude is you're entrapped by a married, and to get your way out of that, you need to work with the nearby Ifrit, Ginny, and Dow on this island, and do jobs for everyone. You know, essentially create payments, and that gives you a chance to wrestle the married, and if you win, you can go. It's a fun idea. It's something which, though it technically could be very time consuming for the characters, there's not much to it. And the final one, Shark Food, is just undead pirates, ghoul pirates. So again, that's an encounter. So though I'd say the Ginny's Clause has some of the least information on the setting, it has 3 kind of really interesting, usable, not just vignettes. I mean, the undead pirates, that's really a vignette encounter on a table, isn't it? But the Afriti, oh sorry, the noble genie ones, that's a decent idea that needs developing. And the mage who has trapped you, you know, his Selenites have trapped you here, so you have to do a job for him. And there's different NPCs to deal with who may or may not be trustworthy. The Ram, the 2 women who live on the island, the Rock. Like this thing, you know, that's actually pretty usable. But it's just not quite fully executed. And then finding the steaming isles, again, you get some tales here before anything else, actually, which is interesting. You're told, you know, a bunch of legends about the area which you can share. You then get rather than having a normal encounter table, you then do get a table 5, where you normally get the encounter table. Creatures wise and foolish, and this is lots of animals, and the fact that these islands are mostly inhabited by intelligent animals, and yeah, that's fun. And this is a pretty decent idea. There is one human city founded by Jemina the Virtuous, co-founder of the colony, and then a lot of refugees from the ruined kingdoms of Nag and Kedar have ended up here historically. So there's this little kind of human settlement, and then there's all these intelligent animals, and that's a fun setup again, and it's executed reasonably well. I mean, the animals, you get stuff like the frogs are complacently self-important in their ponds. Frogs don't know much but are free with their advice. Tiger. The tigers are fearsome warriors and clever scholars, particularly adept at finding ways to twist the meaning of the law to suit their savage natures. One more. The beetle, far wiser than they appear. The beetle knows much that is secret. They are despised by most other animals, making them cantankerous and irritating. These are good. 1-sentence descriptions of how the animals will act, what they are like. Now, I just want, the thing with any of these really good ideas that he comes up with is, I'm like, could I just have a 32-page module on just this stuff? Like, not literally just the animals, but kind of an adventure that's genuinely based around this, rather than a 16-page book that's kind of trying to fulfill a few different objectives. and then has a 3.5, 4.5 page, or whatever it is. No, sorry, to be fair. It's 7.5 page adventure. Praise be the lawgiver. Now the thing here, this starts, so the weakness here is you have to get the players to the island, and rather than just thinking maybe they'll go there for some reason, there are like 3 pages of events that force the players to land there. So that's bad, that sucks. It's not, I would say you get, even very early on in first edition modules, you occasionally get a thing like this that says this happens. But it's nearly always much more understated. It's just here's a way to get the players to get involved in the, whereas by this point you have, and Freedom is, which I have reviewed, as I say, one of the worst examples of this. Here are just millions of ways to force the players to do the thing you want because they are not allowed to do the thing they want. And here you've obviously got examples like you're not allowed to kill the NPCs who are, following you around the city, that kind of thing. But yeah, once you've got on the island, and you go around the islands a bit, essentially, you're going to get hungry, and then it just says someone stalks an ice fat and unusually tame gazelle, kills it, butchers it, roasts it for a great feast. And this means you committed a crime. And this is actually after several pages of forcing the players to get there and to wander around and sort of get a sense of the, they're getting stuck to this magnetic lodestone thing, going around some fog. They might meet some animals, but probably they don't speak to any animals. Is that there's just stuff happening to the ship, and it's just there to get the players to feel like, oh, this is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? You then get the actual inciting incident over halfway through the adventure, which is you kill an intelligent animal, and eventually a blood price is demanded, which would be 2 humans for 1 animal. But you might be able to negotiate with the Shah, the animal Shah, and you might be able to come up with an alternative thing, such as servitude to the family of the slain animals, becoming vegetarian. However, if you don't come to peace, then they might attack the humans who live there, and and essentially, if that happens, that's bad for you because the gods will be angry at you because this city is particularly dedicated to upholding the law, and as long as it does in its secret place, then the rest of the land of fate will still have it, eventually. Even if bad things happen, it will not fall. And then if you've made friends with the Shah, you get a bit of the great treasure off him, or the great treasure itself, or a clue. There is also a map booklet. It's in black and white, which means that any map, it also has ship diagrams, which are not bad. It has this things like it has here's a map of routes and so on around the islands. A current map. These are usable where the maps are textured. So for instance, here the lower one, this is the rock mountain with the island where the kind of the mages trapped you. The lower one there is just bad, isn't it? Because it's not got any verity in its reproduction. It's much too dark. You also in here randomly have a list of the clues. You are told the clues are in here, to be fair, but this is where they put the 6 clues, or 5 clues. You also have, the ogre village is again just too dark. So it's decent. What you can probably tell from what I've said is that I like it, and I defy anyone to be like to say I couldn't like it in that sense. I think there's enough to like. There's plenty to like. There's a setting that works quite well. There's a theme that works quite well. There are adventure locales that work quite well, and there are a couple of the adventures which you can see, if you just shook them out a bit, actually are quite compelling and thematically strong. They're both a D&D adventure you can play, but also they are thematically strong and represent the theme to you. I don't mind the failed experiments, in the sense I'm happy to be told for someone to say, oh, I wonder if we could run a game like this, because then you can conclude maybe you can't. That's not a problem. What I think stops Golden Voyages from not just being an okay adventure, but from being a genuinely really good adventure, and Cook had a couple of genuinely very good adventures in his catalogue. What stops it from ascending that height of being a very good adventure or a great adventure is 2 things. One, the consistent disgust for players choosing things. Players shouldn't choose things. That's not a good story. This is bad design and is basically instantly a disqualifying mark for kind of, can it be a great adventure? But two, the other thing is and this is hardly the only module I've reviewed here, classic module I've reviewed here with this problem, but a complete lack of perspective about the kinds of things in the module which you should emphasize. There's a good section on rules. There's okay sections on a few key locations, settlements. The organisation, the booklets based on each set of islands can be debated, but I get it. But rather that you've got things where you have an adventure, a long adventure, where half of it is just forcing the players to get to a point, and then suddenly the interesting thing where they're having to negotiate with talking animals who they might have killed to say, and there's also like a holy city of humans in the midst of these animals who could easily kill the holy city. That's good, that's clever, but you don't get to do very much of that. The idea that you're like, oh, well, you've got to negotiate with these 4 genies to get free from servitude. That's very Al-Qadimish, and it can definitely be D&D'd, but the particular things he puts out there are fairly thin and not super detailed and, just fine. It's underexploited, so you've got a thing where there's just a very poor sense of when to push and when to just suggest. Nonetheless, I think if you're running Al-Qadim or another Arabian legends influenced kind of story, then I think this is worth it. I think if you're interested in just interesting adventure design without requiring it to be totally great, I would potentially go for this. Anyway, that's it for today. I will